80-year-old Margaret Higgins stood on her porch, clutching a snub-nosed revolver hidden deep inside her wool cardigan, staring down 30 heavily armed Hells Angels. Local law enforcement was utterly paralyzed by this notorious chapter. Yet what this frail widow did next didn't just break the standoff, it unraveled a massive criminal empire. Nobody in the sleepy, pine-bordered town of Cedar Ridge ever locked their doors before the summer of 2018. Nestled on the rugged outskirts of the Pacific Northwest, it was a sanctuary of retirees, local shop owners, and quiet cul-de-sacs. Margaret Higgins had lived at the end of Elm Street for 42 years. A retired trauma nurse, and the widow of a highly decorated military intelligence officer, Margaret spent her twilight years cultivating prize-winning hydrangeas and baking sourdough bread for the local parish. She was 80 years old, stood barely 5'2", and walked with a slight limp from a hip replacement. To the naked eye, she was the epitome of harmless fragility. Then came the roar of the engines. It started in late July. A deafening, ground-shaking thunder that shattered the afternoon peace. Dozens of custom Harley-Davidsons rumbled down Elm Street, a parade of black leather chrome and menace. They pulled into the sprawling abandoned lumber warehouse, directly adjacent to Margaret's modest half-acre property. Within 48 hours, an 8-foot-tall chain-link fence, topped with razor wire, was erected. Blacked-out SUVs idled at the gates. The notorious Death Valley chapter of the Hells Angels had officially claimed Cedar Ridge as their new regional headquarters. Leading the pack was Mike "Iron" Gallagher, a hulking 6'4" man with a spiderweb tattoo wrapping across his throat and a rap sheet longer than a CVS receipt. Gallagher had recently beaten a federal racketeering charge on a technicality and was looking to establish a stronghold far away from the prying eyes of big city syndicates. Cedar Ridge, with its underfunded police department, consisting of exactly 14 officers, was the perfect target. Almost overnight, the town's atmosphere turned toxic. The bikers essentially held the neighborhood hostage. Throttle-revving contests at 3 in the morning became the norm. Aggressive guard dogs patrolled the perimeter. Residents who dared to complain found their car tires slashed or dead animals thrown onto their lawns. The local hardware store owner, an elderly man named Peter, was hospitalized with a shattered jaw after politely asking a biker to move his motorcycle from a loading zone. Cedar Ridge Police Detective Kenneth Rossi, a seasoned but exhausted cop who had moved to the town for a quieter life, found himself completely outmatched. His department lacked the tactical gear, the manpower, and the budget to launch a full-scale raid on a fortified compound. Every time Rossi or his partner, Officer James Dempsey, responded to a noise complaint at the warehouse, they were met by a wall of silent, glaring prospects and a smirking Gallagher who would waive a heavily redacted legal permit for a private social club. "Our hands are tied. Mrs. Higgins," Detective Rossi explained gently one afternoon, sipping iced tea in Margaret's pristine kitchen. The windows rattled violently as a motorcycle engine backfired next door. "Unless we catch them committing a felony in plain sight or get a warrant backed by hard federal evidence, the DA won't touch them. You need to keep your head down. Don't provoke them. Please." Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, her pale blue eyes fixed on the razor wire visible through her lace curtains. "Kenneth, my husband Robert, fought in 2 wars. We bought this house with the money he bled for. I'm not spending my final years living as a prisoner in my own home just because some overgrown bullies like to play dress-up in leather vests." Rossi sighed, running a hand over his face. "Margaret, I'm serious. Gallagher isn't some neighborhood delinquent. He's ruthless." "So am I, detective," she replied softly. The inciting incident happened exactly 1 week later. Margaret was in her greenhouse meticulously pruning her orchids when a raucous party erupted next door. Beer bottles were being thrown over the property line. Margaret ignored it, humming to herself, until a heavy glass bottle of whiskey sailed over the fence, smashing through the glass roof of her greenhouse. Shards of jagged glass rained down, one slicing a deep 3-inch gash across Margaret's forearm. Blood soaked into the soil of her orchids. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't call 911. She calmly walked into her bathroom, cleaned the wound with hydrogen peroxide, sutured it herself with a medical kit she kept under the sink, and wrapped it in crisp white gauze. Then she walked out to her back porch, picked up the shattered neck of the whiskey bottle, and looked through the chain-link fence. On the other side, Gallagher and 3 other bikers, including his violently unpredictable enforcer, William Dutch Hayes, were laughing uproariously, pointing at the broken greenhouse. Gallagher stepped up to the fence, blowing cigar smoke into the air. "Oops," he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Looks like a little property damage, Grandma. Better call those useless cops." Margaret stepped right up to the steel mesh. She didn't flinch at the smoke or the sheer size of the men looming over her. She looked Gallagher dead in the eyes. "You boys have made a very severe miscalculation," Margaret said, her voice eerily calm and steady. "It wasn't a shout, it was a promise." Gallagher laughed, a booming, ugly sound. "Go knit a sweater, old lady, before you get hurt." Margaret turned her back on them and walked inside. She didn't call Detective Rossi. Instead, she walked down into her basement, unlocked a heavy steel footlocker belonging to her late husband, and began her work. For the next 3 weeks, Margaret became a ghost in her own home. To the bikers, it looked like they had successfully intimidated the old woman into submission. Her curtains remained drawn. She no longer sat on her porch reading the morning paper. Gallagher and his crew assumed she was cowering in her living room, waiting to die. They couldn't have been more wrong. Behind the drawn floral curtains, Margaret was running a highly sophisticated surveillance operation. Her late husband, Colonel Robert Higgins, had not just been an intelligence officer. He had been a master of logistics and psychological warfare. Margaret had spent 30 years absorbing his methods, helping him organize classified dossiers. Using Robert's military-grade long-range binoculars and an array of digital recording equipment she had quietly ordered online, Margaret began meticulously logging the Hells Angels' activities from her second-story attic window. She wasn't looking for noise violations. She was looking for the lifeblood of their criminal enterprise. Her triage nurse background gave her an unparalleled attention to detail. She noticed patterns that the overworked Detective Rossi had completely missed. She logged the exact arrival and departure times of unmarked panel vans. She noticed that the vans only arrived on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. She recorded the license plates tracking which ones were local and which belonged to out-of-state rental companies. More importantly, Margaret noticed the blind spot. The bikers had installed high-end security cameras around their perimeter, but they had angled them to monitor the streets and the front gates. They completely neglected the narrow, heavily wooded ravine that ran directly behind both of their properties, assuming the dense brush made it impassable. Margaret exploited this. Dressed in dark clothing and using her intimate knowledge of the terrain, the 80-year-old woman spent several nights crawling through the brush of the ravine. She mapped out the weak points in their fencing. She discovered a rusted drainage pipe that ran directly from the warehouse's basement, emptying out into the woods. The smell emanating from that pipe wasn't just raw sewage, it was the sharp chemical stench of acetone and anhydrous ammonia. They weren't just storing weapons or throwing parties. Gallagher's chapter was running a massive high-yield methamphetamine laboratory right under the town's nose. Armed with this knowledge, Margaret didn't go to the local police. She knew Rossi's department was compromised not by corruption, but by sheer incompetence and fear. A leak would get her killed. Instead, She needed to force the bikers to make a catastrophic error. She needed them to cross the line in a way that would bring the federal government crashing down on them, leaving no legal loopholes. She began her psychological warfare. It started subtly. Every morning at precisely 6 a.m., just as the bikers were nursing their hangovers, Margaret would wheel a massive industrial-grade stereo speaker onto her porch. She didn't play classical music or talk radio. She played high-frequency, ear-piercing audio files of screeching metal and dental drills sounds she knew triggered severe migraines and psychological distress techniques she remembered her husband discussing. She would play it for exactly 9 minutes, just under the legal threshold for a formal noise ordinance violation in the county, and then switch it off. The bikers were infuriated. When they yelled at her over the fence, she simply smiled, sipping her tea, wearing earplugs disguised as hearing aids. Then she escalated. Margaret began casually dropping hints in town, knowing the bikers had informants. At the local grocery store, speaking loudly to the cashier, while Dutch Hayes was buying beer in the next aisle. Margaret sighed. It's such a shame about those nice boys next door. I had to mail a very thick envelope of photographs to my nephew in the FBI back in Washington yesterday. Strange vans in the middle of the night. So much chemical smell. Dutch froze. Margaret didn't even look at him. She just paid for her apples and limped away. The bait was set. Margaret knew that men like Gallagher and Dutch operated purely on paranoia and ego. They couldn't ignore a threat to their lab, especially from an old woman they viewed as an easy target. They wouldn't wait for a legal warrant. They would try to silence her immediately. On a stormy Tuesday night, the trap was sprung. At 1:15 a.m., the power to Margaret's house was abruptly cut. The streetlights outside flickered and died. Rain lashed against the windows. Inside her pitch-black living room, Margaret sat perfectly still in a high-backed leather armchair, fully dressed, her breathing slow and controlled. The snub-nosed revolver, a pristine .38 special, rested heavily in her lap. She heard the faint metallic snip of the chain-link fence being cut at the back of her property. Then the soft crunch of heavy boots on her gravel pathway. 3 men. She tracked their movements entirely by sound. A crowbar shattered the glass of her back door. The deadbolt was violently forced open. Flashlight beams sliced through the darkness of her kitchen. "Find the old hag," Gallagher's voice hissed over the thunder. "Find the computer, find whatever photos she has, and make it look like she fell down the stairs. Dutch, check the basement." Margaret didn't move. She waited until she heard the heavy footsteps creak into the hallway, moving toward the basement door. She had intentionally left the basement door slightly ajar, a soft, battery-powered lantern glowing invitingly at the bottom of the stairs. Dutch sneered, leading another biker, a massive brute named Rollins, toward the light. They pushed the door open and stomped down the wooden steps, expecting to find Margaret's surveillance hub. Instead, they found a room stripped entirely bare, save for a single table in the center. On the table sat a glowing laptop. Dutch lunged for the laptop, grinning. "Got it, Mike!" he yelled up the stairs. He grabbed the mouse to wake the screen. The moment the screen illuminated, a loud mechanized clang echoed through the house. Margaret had severed the internal wiring of her own basement door hours ago. It was a solid oak door reinforced with steel plating by her late husband during the Cold War paranoia. She had rigged a simple gravity-fed deadbolt release attached to a tripwire at the bottom of the stairs. When Dutch hit the tripwire to reach the table, the heavy door slammed shut at the top of the stairs, instantly engaging 3 external steel deadbolts. Down in the basement, Dutch and Rollins spun around. "Hey, the door!" Rollins shouted, rushing up the stairs and throwing his massive shoulder against the wood. It didn't budge a fraction of an inch. Upstairs in the living room, Gallagher heard the panic. He charged down the hallway toward the basement door, raising his flashlight. He didn't make it. As Gallagher stepped into the center of the hallway, the beam of his flashlight caught a figure sitting in the armchair at the end of the corridor. Margaret. Before Gallagher could raise his weapon, the blinding 10,000 lumen glare of a tactical strobe light mounted to the ceiling installed by Margaret just that afternoon flashed directly into his eyes. Gallagher screamed, dropping his gun and clutching his face, completely blinded and disoriented. Margaret stood up calmly. She didn't point her revolver at him. She didn't have to. She simply pressed a button on a small remote control in her left hand. Immediately, the shrill, deafening wail of an industrial air raid siren erupted from the speakers she had hidden in the ceiling vents. But the sound wasn't the worst part. "Detective Rossi," Margaret said, speaking clearly into a cell phone she had already connected to the police dispatcher 5 minutes before the break-in. "This is Margaret Higgins at 442 Elm Street. 3 armed men from the Hells Angels compound have broken into my home. I am locked in my bedroom. I fear for my life. Please send help." Gallagher, stumbling blindly in the hallway, panicked. "You crazy old witch!" he roared, blindly grabbing for his dropped pistol, but Margaret had already stepped back into her master bedroom, slamming and locking the heavy door behind her. Down in the basement, Dutch was violently kicking the reinforced door, screaming in frustration. The laptop screen he had triggered was now displaying a terrifying message in bright red block letters: "Files successfully transmitted to DEA server. Estimated ETA of Federal Strike Team 4 minutes. It was a fake screensaver Margaret had coded herself, but Dutch didn't know that. Panic set in. The bikers were trapped in the basement, their boss was blinded and stumbling in the hallway, and the sirens were wailing loud enough to wake the entire county. 5 minutes later, Detective Rossi's cruiser skidded onto Margaret's lawn, followed by 3 other patrol cars. Rossi sprinted toward the house, his sidearm drawn, expecting to find the gruesome murder of an 80-year-old widow. His heart pounded in his throat as he kicked open the shattered back door. What he saw next stopped him dead in his tracks, a sight that would shock the entire Cedar Ridge Police Department to its core and change the town forever. Officer James Dempsey kicked the shattered door frame, sweeping his heavy tactical flashlight across the rain-soaked living room. What the Cedar Ridge police officers expected to find was a horrific crime scene. What they actually found defied all logical explanation. Mike Gallagher, the terrifying Goliath of the Death Valley motorcycle chapter, was curled into a trembling fetal position on an antique Persian rug. He was openly weeping. The agonizing wail of the industrial air raid siren, combined with the military-grade strobe light still pulsing rhythmically from the plaster ceiling, had completely overloaded his sensory nervous system. He had vomited all over his own leather cutter and was blindly clawing at his face, begging for the blinding light to stop. "Police, keep your hands where I can see them," Detective Rossi barked over the deafening noise, though his command was entirely unnecessary. Gallagher wasn't fighting anyone. He was utterly broken. Rossi kicked the discarded pistol away, grabbed the massive biker by his heavy jacket, and aggressively zip-tied his thick wrists behind his back. Suddenly, the deafening siren cut off. The blinding strobe light went dark, replaced by the soft, warm glow of a Tiffany lamp clicking on in the corner. Margaret Higgins stood in the doorway of her master bedroom, looking perfectly composed. She wore a neatly pressed navy blue cardigan over her floral nightgown, and her silver hair was perfectly pinned in place. In her right hand, she held a steaming mug of chamomile tea. In her left, she casually held the .38 special revolver barrel, pointed safely toward the hardwood floor. "Good evening, Kenneth," Margaret said, warmly, taking a small sip of her tea. "I apologize for the racket. I believe there are 2 more gentlemen currently residing in my basement." Rossi stared at the 80-year-old woman, his jaw slightly slack. He holstered his weapon and wiped the rain from his forehead. "Margaret, what on earth did you do to him?" "Just a little psychological redirection," she replied calmly, setting her revolver on a decorative doily atop a side table. "My late husband utilized similar techniques during interrogations. Now about those two downstairs. I wouldn't open that door just yet. They are under the distinct impression that a federal strike team is currently waiting for them." Down in the basement, the heavy thudding against the oak door suddenly stopped. A muffled, panicked voice echoed through the wood. "Hey, hey, is that the local cops?" "Listen to me, it's Dutch. We surrender. Do not let the feds down here. We are unarmed. Get us out of here." Rossi and Dempsey exchanged a bewildered glance. Dutch Hayes, a man who had once hospitalized 3 bouncers with a pool cue, was begging to be arrested. "I coded a rather convincing decoy screen on an old laptop," Margaret explained, noticing the detectives' confusion. It informed them that all of their illicit financial records and photographs of their narcotics operation had been successfully transmitted to the Drug Enforcement Administration. "Speaking of which, Kenneth, you are going to need this." Margaret walked over to a small mahogany bookshelf and pulled out a massive 3-inch thick black binder. She dropped it heavily onto the kitchen counter. Across the front, written in elegant cursive on a white label, were the words "Warehouse Activity Log" and "Chemical Analysis." Rossi opened the binder. Inside were hundreds of high-resolution photographs, neatly time-stamped and cross-referenced with license plate numbers, vehicle registration details, and individual suspect profiles. There were detailed maps of the warehouse perimeter, complete with patrol schedules. Most damning of all were the extensive soil and water sample analysis reports Margaret had compiled from the ravine, proving the presence of massive quantities of anhydrous ammonia, pseudoephedrine, and red phosphorus. "Margaret," Rossi whispered, flipping through the immaculate pages. This is a masterclass in surveillance. You built a completely airtight federal case. How did you even test the soil?" "I am a master gardener, Kenneth," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Testing soil, pH, and chemical runoff is second nature to me. Once I realized they were using the rusted drainage pipe to vent their methamphetamine laboratory into the woods gathering, the chemical evidence was simply a matter of midnight sample collection. Furthermore, I already mailed a duplicate copy of this exact binder to Special Agent Mitchell Cole at the DEA regional office in Seattle. They received it yesterday morning. I suspect you will be receiving a phone call from him very shortly." Right on cue, Rossi's police radio crackled to life. The police dispatcher's voice was frantic. "Unit 7, Detective Rossi, are you on scene at Elm Street? I have a Special Agent Cole on a secure line. He says federal arrest warrants have just been authorized for the Death Valley compound. He is demanding we secure the perimeter until his tactical units arrive." Rossi slowly closed the binder, looking at the frail widow sipping her tea. "You didn't just defend yourself, Margaret. You orchestrated this entire raid." "They broke my greenhouse," Margaret stated simply. "And they frightened Peter at the hardware store. Bullies rely on the assumption that decent people will cower. I simply removed that assumption." By dawn, Cedar Ridge looked like a military staging ground. The quiet suburban street was flooded with heavily armored black SUVs, flashing red and blue lights, and dozens of federal agents clad in tactical gear. The Hells Angels had anticipated a raid from the underfunded local police, a force they knew they could outgun and intimidate. They were completely unprepared for a coordinated, overwhelming siege led by the DEA, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and state troopers. Special Agent Mitchell Cole, a stern veteran investigator with piercing grey eyes, stood in Margaret's kitchen, drinking black coffee and looking out the window at the warehouse. Federal agents were actively pulling out illegal firearms, bricks of cash, and massive plastic drums of chemical precursors. The biker compound was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. In 20 years of federal law enforcement, Agent Cole said, shaking his head in sheer disbelief, I have never seen an intelligence dossier put together with this level of precision. We had suspected Gallagher was setting up a super lab in this region, but we couldn't get a single informant close to him. He ran a completely closed loop, and you managed to break his entire syndicate from an attic window with binoculars and a chemistry kit. Margaret sat at her table calmly, buttering a piece of sourdough toast. My husband always said that arrogance is the loudest alarm bell, Agent Cole. They ignored me because I am old. They assumed my age made me deaf, blind, and stupid. They built a fortress to keep out the wolves, completely forgetting that the mouse was already living next door. The fallout from that stormy Tuesday night was spectacular and utterly devastating for the criminal organization. The moment Gallagher was thrown into a federal holding cell, he realized the scope of his failure. He hadn't been bested by an undercover sting or a rival gang. He had been outsmarted, terrified, and captured by an elderly widow. The sheer humiliation of the incident shattered his reputation. When Dutch Hayes and Rollins were pulled from Margaret's basement, they were so thoroughly panicked by the fake DEA transmission screen that they immediately began cooperating with investigators to secure plea deals. Dutch sang like a canary, offering up the locations of 3 other hidden storage facilities across state lines. Within a week, 52 members of the Death Valley chapter had been indicted on federal racketeering, narcotics, manufacturing, and attempted murder charges. 6 months later, the trial commenced in the federal courthouse. The defense attorneys, desperate to save their clients, tried to paint Margaret as a senile, paranoid vigilante who had illegally gathered evidence. They attempted to discredit her mental faculties before federal Judge Harrison Miller, hoping to have the binder thrown out of court. It was the worst legal mistake they could have possibly made. When Margaret took the witness stand dressed in her Sunday best, she completely dismantled the defense team. She answered their aggressive questions with surgical precision, citing specific chemical weights, times of day, and federal statutes regarding plain view observation. She remained entirely unfazed by their shouting, calmly correcting the lead defense lawyer on his mispronunciation of methamphetamine synthesis. Judge Harrison Miller, a notorious disciplinarian, was seen visibly hiding a smile behind his hand as Margaret ruthlessly schooled the expensive defense attorneys. By the end of her 4-hour testimony, the jury was completely captivated, and the defense was in absolute tatters. Mike Gallagher was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Dutch Hayes received 25 years. The warehouse next to Margaret's home was seized under federal asset forfeiture laws, completely demolished, and the land was eventually donated to the town. Cedar Ridge slowly returned to the quiet, peaceful sanctuary it had once been. The deafening roar of motorcycles was replaced once again by the sounds of lawn mowers, chirping birds, and children playing in the streets. Detective Rossi was promoted to chief of police, crediting the massive bust to the undeniable courage of one local resident. As for Margaret Higgins, she refused to accept any public awards or media interviews. When a national news network tried to park a satellite truck on Elm Street to dub her the Vigilante Grandma, she simply turned her sprinklers on them until they left. She went right back to her quiet life, baking bread, and spending long afternoons in her newly repaired greenhouse. But things were undeniably different. She was no longer just the nice old lady at the end of the street. She was the undisputed guardian of Cedar Ridge. Every morning, the local police cruisers would deliberately take a slow patrol down Elm Street, the officers giving a respectful salute to the small silver-haired woman tending to her orchids. Even the rowdiest teenagers in town knew better than to ride their skateboards too close to her property line. Margaret had proven a universal truth that the criminal underworld had tragically forgotten. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly on a porch, knitting a sweater waiting for you to make a fatal mistake. If Margaret Higgins's incredible bravery and brilliant tactical mind left you speechless, please hit that like button right now. This fearless 80-year-old widow proved that true courage doesn't require muscles, just a sharp mind and an unbreakable spirit. Don't forget to share this wild, true story with your friends and family to remind them never to underestimate a grandmother. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications for more jaw-dropping real-life mysteries and astonishing tales of survival. See you soon.